Can modern nations adopt laws from the Old Testament? Let's explore. Did you know that in the Old Testament, Israel had no formal prison system? The judicial penalties in their law prescribed mostly restitution and corporal or capital punishments. For a civil misdeed, the transgressor hence compensated a wronged party, suffered a flogging, or paid with his or her life. Is that wise? Is it merely ancient and barbaric that the law of Moses capitally punished adulterers, kidnappers, rapists, and perjurers? Some nations in the present day, in fact, practice similar such laws. Now, should a Christian permit or oppose their adoption or incidental conformity to Old Testament laws? According to Moses, speaking in God's place, the law was not merely the terms of Israel's covenant with God, but also their witness to the nations. I have taught you statutes and rules, as the Lord my God commanded me, that you should do them in the land that you are entering to take possession of it. Keep them and do them, for that will be your wisdom and your understanding in the sight of the peoples, who, when they hear all these statutes, will say, surely this great nation is a wise and understanding people. And what great nation is there that has statutes and rules so righteous as all this law that I set before you today? Not only was the law wisdom in the sight of the nations, the kings of the earth are commanded to be wise. Where then may they find wisdom, if not otherwise, from a great nation whose witness bore a wise and understanding people and who practice statutes and rules that are to be wisdom in their sight? King David hence pledged to also speak of God's testimonies before kings and not be put to shame. And by testimonies, he here speaks of God's statutes and laws. Thus he says, I have kept your testimonies, and your testimonies are wonderful, therefore my soul keeps them. And hence the paraphrastic New Living Translation reads, I will speak to kings about your laws. And the NIV likewise, I will speak of your statutes before kings. If the law proclaims wisdom, why would someone claim that with respect to its non-peaceful statutes, the portrait of God endorsing these laws is an accommodation to the culturally conditioned mindset of the Israelites? Perhaps they might say that the appearance of wisdom to the nations related not to the nations over time through to the present day, but to what was practically wise in the ancient Near East. Of course, however, Jesus said that until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And that therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. A chief objection you'll find concerns the teaching of Christ with respect to the lex talionis, the law of just retribution. Greg Boyd asserts that since both Jesus and Paul repudiate this principle, it is enough to demonstrate that the violent dimension of the law was a divine accommodation to the fallen and culturally conditioned state of the people God was working with. Here's Jesus' words on the use of the lex talionis. You have heard that it was said, an eye for an eye and a tooth for a tooth. But I say to you, do not resist the one who is evil, but if anyone slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. Remember though, his teaching that it is easier for heaven and earth to pass away than for one dot of the law to become void. He said that until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. And that therefore, whoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches others to do the same will be called least in the kingdom of heaven. But whoever does them and teaches them will be called great. Now, one might think that Jesus would teach, Whoever relaxes one of the least of these commands and teaches others so will be called least, and then do precisely that a few verses on. You have heard, but I say to you. A better understanding might instead take the corrective as one of application. The law of lex talionis, eye for an eye and life for a life, describes the equivalence of penalty required for those convicted of civil wrongdoing under God's rule in biblical Israel. Perhaps it is possible to emphasize this prescription in place of God's precepts for interpersonal relations, including love for adversaries, and to wait on the Lord and He will avenge you. Consider also that the notion of contrast in Jesus' words, but I say to you, is between what you have heard. This differs from his normal introduction of a scripture verse, it is written. Jesus doesn't say, it is written, but I say to you, but rather, you have heard, and then a contrast follows. That suggests public teaching, rather than scripture, is under challenge or in need of some corrective. Whether you think this interpretation is a good fit, it can't be worse than the one that makes Jesus contradict himself. Whatever one should make of the Old Testament laws and their present application, we should believe that Jesus neither outmoded its precepts, even its civil precepts, nor cast aspersion on their moral character. We should believe that the law, that is, all these statutes and rules, is wisdom in the sight of the nations, and we may, like David, speak them before rulers and not be put to shame.